Hey everybody, it's John. This is my presentation on my research proposal for our course, our seminar in Health and Human Performance course. This is something I've been working on for about 2 to 3 years. So some parts are really well developed. Other parts are a little rough, as you're going to see. I definitely need some feedback to try and fine tune some pieces. I look forward to your feedback. So I know from our other courses that we've had together, you may know that I have focused on ketogenic diets. This is something that I've known about for maybe 5 or 6 years and really have a keen interest in the way they could impact athletic performance and really specifically trying to find out how they impact strength and power in anaerobic athletes. Most of you are familiar with ketogenic or keto diets for their impact on weight loss. And obviously there's a lot of products out there, a lot of people trying to make a lot of money off of the weight loss that results from ketogenic diets. And studies have proven that they work. They do cause weight loss. A lot of the studies, though, just attributed this simply to caloric restriction. And a lot of it doesn't consider the metabolic effect of ketogenic diets, the impact that it has on body fat percentage, the impact that it has on other tissues. Ketogenic diets have been shown really to cause body fat loss and not necessarily loss of other tissues, whereas simple caloric restriction in many cases will cause a loss in total tissue. So that's an important note to keep in mind as we go forward with this. Ketogenic diets have been applied to other conditions, specifically epilepsy. That's one that's been studied for close to 100 years, and that is a pretty effective therapeutic intervention for epileptics, and that's been known for a long time. Obviously, diabetes being a metabolic disease and one that causes insulin resistance, ketogenic diets could potentially have a positive impact on that population as well by bringing back insulin sensitivity. So there's definitely potential there. When it comes to athletes, most of the research that's out there has specifically focused on the aerobic population, specifically long distance endurance athletes, marathon runners, triathletes. A lot of them are willing to kind of experiment on themselves, I guess. But specifically, Jeff Volek, who is at Ohio State University, Stephen Phinney, they've been doing research that's been going on for 20 years. They have found quite a bit of promise with ketogenic diets as far as how they could potentially extend the amount of time people can perform in endurance sports by not hitting the wall. They don't run out of glucose because they can use fat as a fuel source. At least that's what the theory is. Really, those two have found, though, that these diets have to be well formulated. So that's one of the key things I'm going to touch on with my research is that most ketogenic diets are not well formulated. Those that are studied, the people that are doing the research, it almost seems as though they're maybe trying to prove that low carbohydrate diets don't work. And so they don't formulate the diets well. If the diets are formulated well, it seems as though they do have potential. But again, trying to stay objective here, I'll get into that in a little bit. The research really is lacking on the anaerobic side. We really don't know strength and power athletes. Can they get stronger? Can they increase their power? Can they get bigger, stronger, faster? I guess is really the key thing that I've really wanted to focus on in my research. We don't know that. We can't answer that question. Most would say they can't because they need carbohydrate as a substrate to induce muscle growth and other things like that. Many of us know the human body is very resilient, and there's a potential that it could adapt. And is that a better adaptation or is that a worse state? We really don't know. We also don't know if the ketogenic diet is a short-term therapeutic option or it's a long-term intervention. Should an athlete go on a ketogenic diet for 8 weeks and then transition off? Should they go on a ketogenic diet and stay on it for 3 or 4 years? We really don't know the answer to that question yet. But again, my research is trying to focus on that. So this is really why this is important, is because it, for the most part, doesn't exist. The relevant research that's out there really comes to a few conclusions. The research that does exist shows that low carbohydrate, high fat ketogenic diets they cause weight loss that spares lean mass. So it tends to burn exclusively fat and does not induce muscle loss or other tissue loss, namely organs or bones. It tends to specifically focus on the fat mass. And so people who lose weight on low carbohydrate diets, specifically ketogenic diets, will lose body fat first, okay? So that's one key thing to keep in mind. Another key thing is a state of ketosis is really only possible in extremely low carbohydrate situations. So going low carb-ish, 100 grams or less per day, probably not enough for most. Most studies, and I've noted a couple here on the slide, you got to be at least 50 grams of carbohydrate or less per day, and that has to last for several weeks to induce ketosis. So a lot of the studies, again, they don't get into a range like that. 100 or less is not enough for most. So it's got to be well done. And again, blood ketone concentrations are really the key indicator of ketosis. Urine concentrations of ketone, not a good indicator. Breath ketones, also not a good indicator. I'll get into that a little bit later on. A lot of the studies that have attempted to figure out how ketogenic diets impact strength and power, those have been pretty inconclusive. Really the two that I mentioned at the bottom, the Paoli study from 2012, that's the one that those that support the ketogenic diet and use in anaerobic athletes, they tend to go back to all the time. That's the Paoli study in 2012. And this was in gymnasts. And this was a pretty well-designed study. It had the gymnasts go on the ketogenic diet for 30 days and off, and then a control group, they switched. And it showed that the gymnasts lost body mass and their body composition improved. Namely, they lost body fat and their strength performance did not decrease. Another study more recently by Green, that was in Olympic powerlifters, did show that they lost body mass, but they didn't compromise performance. So really my research will try and answer the question, okay, is that better? So if I have an athlete that loses body fat, but they don't lose strength, maybe we can consider them a better athlete. So if I have an athlete go from 200 pounds down to 185 pounds, but don't lose any strength, don't lose any power, maybe they're faster, maybe they are more agile, maybe there's a potential that they are better athletically. So that's really what my research tends to be angled toward. The gaps in literature, I've already mentioned a couple things here. I'm trying to read my own notes here. We can't tell if athletes in strength and power sports will they. We can't tell if athletes' gains in strength and power will be less than their carbohydrate-dependent counterparts. Finally, got those words out. We don't know if an athlete goes into a ketogenic diet, will they gain strength and power at a rate that's slower than their counterparts. So by consuming carbohydrates, are individuals actually able to gain strength and power quicker than those who would restrict a carbohydrate? Most of the studies that are out there, far too short to induce actual ketosis. So a 4-week study on comparing those on a ketogenic diet to one who's not on a ketogenic diet, not long enough. Not nearly long enough. We need a longer period of time than that. We also need studies that allow for what's referred to as a keto adaptation. So typically those that switch to a ketogenic diet, the first couple of weeks can be ugly. It's known as the keto flu. Individuals will get into situations where they don't feel well. Their strength and power would definitely go down. Their aerobic performance would definitely go down. A lot of the athletic measures that I'm focusing on will go down. So to split people into two groups, one in a ketogenic diet and the other on a non-ketogenic diet, and just go 4 weeks. Well, for those first 2 weeks, that ketogenic diet group is going to suffer without a doubt. And the conclusions of that research is going to be that the ketogenic diet is not as effective. In my opinion, that's not fair. We need to put people in situations where they're allowed to keto adapt if that's a real thing, and then start the measurement process. We also find that ketone levels are not properly measured in most studies. We need to be doing blood ketone measures. Urine measures are not good because once the body starts to use ketones as a fuel source, they don't show up in urine anymore. And they typically don't show up in breath measurements either. There are multiple, there's 3 different types of ketones. Those would all show up in the blood. And they would stop showing up in urine and breath. So those are not good measurement tools. You get my point, okay? Most studies of ketogenic diets are not well formulated. I'm going to mention that when I go through my research question. We cannot have studies indicating that they're measuring ketogenic diets that have carbohydrate intakes that are 100 grams, 200 grams or more per day. That's not a ketogenic diet. A high protein diet is not a ketogenic diet, okay? Many of the studies that measure strength and power tend to not be very comprehensive. They tend to focus on one particular measure over another. I wanted a study that has multiple measurements of strength and power and not necessarily favor one outcome over another while trying to keep things simple. And hopefully I'm able to do that with the research I put together. Studies that measure body composition include that. And I definitely wanted to include that in my study to make sure that the athletes who were on ketogenic diets or the athletes that were part of the study were indeed losing body fat and not muscle. Many of the measurements of body composition are not very effective. DEXA is the gold standard. Most of us know that. Yeah, you can do underwater weighing. We could do BOD-POD. If I have access, I'd rather do DEXA. I definitely don't want to do skin fold calipers. I definitely don't want to do bioelectrical impedance. I don't think that those are good indicators. There's way too much room for error. They can be way too easily manipulated. So my preference is DEXA. Okay, moving on. So the research question, and I'm going to have to slide you over so you can see it. I'm moving the wrong way. Okay. The question I'm attempting to answer is, does a well-formulated, and I tried to define that, well-formulated, low-carbohydrate, high-fat ketogenic diet positively influence anaerobic athleticism by improving strength-to-weight ratio in collegiate athletes completing an 8-week strength conditioning program? That's a mouthful, okay? Again, key points here. Ketogenic diet has to be well-formulated. Cannot be 100 grams of carbohydrate in a day. Cannot be high protein. That's not a ketogenic diet. It might be a low carbohydrate diet. You can make that argument, but that's not what I'm looking at. If it's a ketogenic diet, 50 grams or less per day, moderate levels of protein. We're focused here on anaerobic athleticism. So specifically strength, power, agility. Think field sport athletes, think football players, soccer players, basketball players, those kind of athletes that are kind of mixing different types of athleticism. And we have to make the program lengthy enough. So yeah, 8 weeks is probably generous, and I get that, but that's really what I'm looking at in terms of inducing strength and power changes, athleticism changes. I'm not sure that can happen in a 6-week program, although the 6-week program might be a little bit more reasonable, okay? The methods, and there's a lot here, and I'll try and take you through this in the time that I have left. The research design, I see this as splitting into 2 groups, one serving as a control who will go through the strength and conditioning program but will not have any kind of dietary intervention. And obviously the other group would be a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet group. I want that group to be on the dietary intervention 2 weeks prior to the strength and conditioning program beginning. I've given you the reasons for that. I want them to be able to adapt to that and get used to using fat as a substrate instead of carbohydrate. Again, that's sometimes an ugly transition. So I want to be able to give individuals an opportunity to do that. The intervention group, this is going to be kind of dicey, and I'm still going to try and figure out how I'm going to do this, but we need to give them a diet consisting of 50 grams of carbohydrate or less with moderate protein and high fat, hopefully 3 meals a day. There is a potential to also provide them with ketone supplementation and also take them through a fasting protocol where either they have a limited eating window or they actually fast for 18 to 24 hours to induce ketosis on a faster rate. So I haven't quite worked out all the details as far as what that would look like, but the dietary intervention could be include supplementation or and or fasting.